Over the course of 2022, Tunisia has become steadily more authoritarian and unstable as its increasingly autocratic president has rolled back political freedoms. Coupled with a declining economic situation, this has seen large numbers of people flee the country, often making the hazardous journey by boat across the Mediterranean. And yet, just a few years ago, things seemed so very different. Tunisia appeared to be on the path to democracy, becoming a model for the wider Arab world. So, just what happened? And is Tunisia really sliding towards a new dictatorship? Hello and welcome. If you're new to the channel, my name is James Kerr-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, security, and statehood. In 2011, the world watched as a wave of demonstrations erupted across the Arab world. Over the space of a few months, popular protests appeared to challenge authoritarian regimes throughout the Middle East and North Africa. However, a decade on, this wave of protests, which became more generally known as the Arab Spring, is a mere memory. Despite the hopes that a new era of democratic rule would emerge in the region, little has seemingly changed. But perhaps the most interesting story is Tunisia. Having been the birthplace of the uprisings, it became the one widely accepted success story of the Arab Spring. And yet, a decade on, it appears to have fallen back into autocratic rule. But is this really the case? The Republic of Tunisia lies in North Africa. To the north and east, it has a Mediterranean coastline. To its south, it borders Libya, and to its west, it neighbours Algeria. At 164,000 square kilometres, or 63,000 square miles, it's the 91st largest member of the United Nations. Its population stands at a little under 12 million. Made up of Berbers and Arabs, including around 15% sub-Saharan Africans, the country is almost wholly Sunni Muslim and uses Arabic as its official language. In 2021, its per capita GDP stood at around $3,924. Excluding the high-income regional states, this makes it slightly higher than the average for the Middle East and North Africa. Tunisia has a long and fascinating history. In ancient times, it was the location of Carthage, the mortal enemy of the Romans, who eventually conquered it and made it the province of Africa, from which the rest of the continent took its name. As the Roman Empire split, it came under Byzantine rule. Then, in the middle of the 7th century, it was conquered by Arabs, who introduced Islam. Following on from this, it would develop its own ruling dynasty before becoming a part of the wider Ottoman Empire in the 16th century. However, our story really begins in the last quarter of the 19th century as France expanded its influence across North Africa. In 1881, it invaded and occupied Tunisia, making it a protectorate. While it formerly remained a monarchy under the Bey of Tunis, the French government now controlled finance, foreign policy, and many other key issues. By the start of the 20th century, opposition to French rule was growing. This led to the establishment of a nationalist movement, the Destour or Constitution Party. Calling for equal rights for Tunisians, in 1934 the group split with the emergence of an alternative wing, the New Constitutional Liberal Party, or Neo-Destour. But it wasn't until after the Second World War that things really began to change. With the advent of decolonisation, pressure grew for independence, and in 1952 an armed uprising emerged. 4 years later, on the 20th of March 1956, France finally granted the country full statehood. Soon afterwards, the Kingdom of Tunisia joined the UN. From the start, the country came under the control of Neo-Destour, which soon instituted a process of radical modernisation. On the 25th of July 1957, the monarchy was abolished, and Tunisia officially became a republic, with Habib Bourguiba, the party's leader and a hero of the independence movement, as president. Adopting a political ideology based on secularism, the limiting of religion in public life, Tunisia quickly became known for its relatively liberal values. For example, it was seen as a leader in terms of women's rights in the Arab world. As for foreign policy, it also took its own path, adopting a distinctly Tunisian nationalist outlook rather than the pan-Arabism that was popular at the time. It also pursued close ties to the West. However, things would change in the decades that followed as Bourguiba steadily increased his grip on power and built a cult of personality. In October 1964, Neo-Destor was renamed the Socialist Destorian Party, becoming the country's only legal political party. In 1975, Bourguiba proclaimed himself president for life. After 30 years, Bourguiba's rule eventually came to an end in 1987. As his health deteriorated and with growing social, political and economic problems, he was declared medically unfit for office by the country's Prime Minister, Zine El Abidine Ben Ali. Placed under effective house arrest, Bourguiba eventually died in 2000. Meanwhile, having installed himself as president, Ben Ali quickly consolidated his control. Ruthlessly suppressing opposition through the state security services, he also imposed tight restrictions on the media. But as he also tried to modernise the country, Tunisia steadily became economically weaker and more corrupt. This all came to a head in late 2010. On the 17th of December, a young market trader, Mohamed Bouazizi, set himself on fire after serial police harassment and demands for bribes. In the days and weeks that followed, major protests erupted across the country as ordinary people voiced their anger and frustration at the government. But while the Tunisian police clamped down on the protests with armed force, the uprisings continued. On the 14th of January 2011, Ben Ali fled the country. Following the overthrow of the Tunisian dictator, the revolutionary spirit spread to other countries in the region, marking the start of what would become known as the Arab Spring. This saw uprisings in Libya and Egypt that eventually forced their long-term leaders, Muammar Gaddafi and Hosni Mubarak, from power. Meanwhile, in Syria, popular protests led to a brutal civil war, although a decade on, Bashar al-Assad remains in office. However, it would be in its birthplace, Tunisia, that the Arab Spring would have its greatest success as the old political structures collapsed and new freedoms were introduced following what became known as the Jasmine Revolution. In October 2011, the country held its first post-revolution elections. This led to the creation of a coalition government led by a moderate Islamist party, the Ennahda movement, and including a liberal centrist party and a centre-left party. This was followed by another general election in October 2014 after the adoption of a new constitution that limited presidential power and increased the role of parliament. But despite the democratic changes, which were widely welcomed internationally, the country faced many problems. Political infighting between the various parliamentary parties, as well as between senior state officials, made effective governance increasingly impossible. At the same time, the economic situation continued to decline, with particularly high levels of youth unemployment. On top of all this, new challenges emerged. Most significantly, the country started to experience growing Islamist activity. This led to several high-profile terrorist attacks in March and June 2015 that left over 60 dead. This devastated the country's important tourist sector. So, why are there now fears about the country's democratic future? It all started with the presidential election in September 2019. This was overwhelmingly won by an independent candidate, Kais Saied, with 3/4 of the vote. On the face of it, there was little to suggest that he would pose any sort of challenge to the country's democracy. A 61-year-old retired professor of constitutional law, he was highly respected, and while he was known to be religious, taking conservative positions on many issues, he was understood to be opposed to extremism. However, despite widespread hopes that he would represent a break from the political infighting, the country's difficulties continued. As popular anger grew in the face of continuing economic problems, now exacerbated by the effects of COVID and the government's mishandling of the situation that left over 30,000 dead, demonstrations erupted. In July 2021, and following deadlock in the parliament, Saied sacked the Prime Minister, suspended Parliament and imposed a state of emergency. Then, in September, he introduced rule by decree. While all this led to an outcry from opponents who argued that it amounted to nothing less than a coup, the president insisted that it was merely a short-term step. As he explained, he'd taken the measures to address the dire economic situation which the fractured government had been unable to solve. However, in the months that followed, he steadily extended his powers. As well as postponing elections, he suspended the Supreme Judicial Council. This was followed on the 25th of July 2022 by a constitutional referendum introducing far-reaching changes to the country's political system, including more extensive presidential powers. Although turnout was low, reaching just 30%, it passed overwhelmingly. All this has had a profound impact on the country. Aside from the rolling back of democracy, Tunisia has continued to collapse economically under a president who critics argue has little to no knowledge of economics. As inflation and unemployment have soared, many thousands of Tunisians have left the country, with many opting to take the dangerous people smuggling route across the Mediterranean. Indeed, over the course of 2022, it's estimated that Tunisians have been the single largest nationality making the hazardous crossing. Meanwhile, there's little sign that the situation on the ground is improving. The long-awaited parliamentary elections, which were held on the 17th of December 2022, saw a pitiful 9% turnout after opposition parties called for a boycott. But for all the evidence of democratic backsliding, there's little sign of external pressure on Saïed. Instead, it appears that many have chosen to give the Tunisian president the benefit of the doubt and want to believe that the measures he's imposed are indeed a necessary short-term step. For example, the EU appears to be treading softly on the issue. Likewise, just days before the elections, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken held a cordial meeting with the Tunisian president, praising the strong relationship between the United States and Tunisia. Then, after the parliamentary elections, the State Department put out a message suggesting that the results were in fact evidence of progress in the country. However, the reality is that the country has rolled back many of its democratic reforms, and significantly so. In its latest report, Freedom House ranked the country as partly free, scoring 64 out of 100. This was a 7-point drop from the year before, when it was ranked as free. And as other observers have noted, even if Saïed can be trusted, his reforms will only make it easier for a successor to revert to the dictatorial practices of the past. But what makes all this particularly worrying is that despite these setbacks, Tunisia remains the most democratically free state in the Arab world, and by a long stretch. Indeed, the next highest on the Freedom House list, Lebanon, scored just 42 out of 100. Worryingly, a decade on from the Arab Spring, the one hope for lasting democratic change in the Middle East and North Africa could well be on the verge of disappearing. I hope you found that interesting. If so, here's a playlist on other issues in the Middle East and North Africa that you might find interesting. Alternatively, here's another video that you might like. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notifications if you haven't already. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.